Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Oh, yes, the intro music. If you saw the show last week, you'll get it. If you didn't, well, Count Saint Germain. David Subith sent me a bunch of ideas for shows. I'd been looking into the Count for some time now, and I thought, well, this would be a good time to get serious about it. For as far back as I could research, people have been looking for some way to live forever, or at least more than 70 or 80 years. It all starts in the Bible. Adam was supposed to have lived for about 930 years. Now, this got me to wondering, how was his eyesight? Did he still have his hair? Do you think his teeth were okay? I'm not anywhere near that old. I still have my hair, which is better than some people I know. Methuselah lived to be 969 years. Noah was 950. In the Middle Ages in Europe, you were lucky to live 40 years. And what a life, too. There was no coffee and no radios. There were no pickups to ride around in, no air conditioning, and no heat in the wintertime. If you're lucky, you had a stove, but that meant you had to go out and chop wood to stay warm. Deodorant hadn't been invented yet. Ooh, and nobody bathed. It wasn't any better on the other side of the globe. People in China were living at about the same length of time, and they had to work just as hard. If all you had to look forward to each morning was hard work, there wasn't much time to sit and ponder things like, how can I live longer so I can work more? The work week was 6 days, sun up till sundown. Those in power did have time for such endeavors, and they spent a lot of time and money looking for ways to live longer. Alchemy was a form of speculative thought that, among other things, tried to transform base metal, such as lead, into silver or gold. They also tried to discover a cure for disease and a way of extending life. Alchemy was the name given in Latin Europe in the 12th century to an aspect of thought that corresponds to astrology, which is apparently an older tradition. Both represent attempts to discover the relationship of man to the cosmos and to exploit that relationship to our benefit. This was not the first try at extending the lifespan. The idea of a drug that could confer immortality appears to come from the ancient Indian Vedas, from some time before 1000 BC. It is believed that the Chinese heard about this idea and they tried to develop it further from there. There are some accounts that say the Chinese interest in alchemy developed in the 4th century BC. Sources mention an alchemist named Zhou Yin, who lived in the 4th century BC and appeared to be highly regarded by the royal courts and the nobles, the folks with all the money. He is believed to have promised his patrons that he could use alchemy to enrich their coffers by creating gold from other metals, and use occult forces to guide them on how to run their kingdoms and their territories to a greater effect. In 175 BC, an edict was issued threatening alchemists not to make counterfeit gold under the penalty of death. It seems that alchemy was already established in China around then. Seeing as there was a law against it, did somebody already figure out how to make gold? Some guy named Rumpelstiltskin, only in Chinese? Why pass a law against making gold? If suddenly gold was showing up everywhere, the value would go down. Also, the wrong folks might get their hands on gold and become a ruling power. The edict did not deter the alchemists, and they were merely changed in direction, with one alchemist appearing at the royal court in 133 BC and proclaiming that he had discovered the secret to immortality. This idea of prolonging life would become the holy grail of Chinese alchemy, their version of the Western Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone was a mythic alchemical substance capable of turning base metals such as mercury into gold or silver. It was also called the Elixir of Life, useful for rejuvenation and for achieving immortality. For centuries, it was the most sought after gold. Gold, not gold. The Philosopher's Stone was the central symbol of the mystic terminology, symbolizing perfection at its finest, enlightenment, and heavenly bliss. Efforts to discover the Philosopher's Stone were known as the magnum opus, or great work. Chinese alchemy became linked with traditional Chinese medicine, which worked by trying to bring harmony to the body and soul. In case you hadn't noticed it, I've got a cat in my lap who keeps pulling on my shirt. It is linked to the idea of immortality to the spirits and minor gods. Rulers were far more interested in living longer, so this became the focus of the alchemists. They sought the elixir of life. Having huge piles of gold was great up until it was time to shuffle off this mortal coil. Then it was just a pile of shiny rock. In 60 BC, Emperor Swan engaged an alchemist named Liu Xiang to increase the lifespan of the emperor by making alchemical gold. Gold was considered to be pure and related to life. By making alchemical gold, they were making a far purer form of gold that would be connected to longevity. After Liu Xiang, the next reference to alchemy occurred in the 2nd or 3rd century BC, where a book called the Santong Chi relates the process of creating a tiny pill made of pure gold that would confer immortality. Because gold did not decay or tarnish, the Chinese believed that it could confer this ability to people. And drinking out of the purest gold drinking vessels, ouch, eating from gold plates and eating pills made from gold would confer this imperishability. She got me by the skin that time. If this attempt didn't work, it was blamed on the gold not being pure enough or the process not being followed to the letter. The Chinese were obsessed with creating gold. However, instead of creating gold for wealth, their obsession was creating gold of the utmost purity so they could create the elixir of life and a way to achieve immortality. China's first emperor launched an obsessive search for the elixir of life before dying at the age of 49 in 210 BC. Qin Shi Huang, who created the world famous terracotta army, ordered a nationwide hunt for some magical elixir that would let him live forever. Along with all those warriors, they found ancient texts. The writings contain an executive order issued by the emperor and awkward assorted awkward replies from regional governments who had failed to find the key to eternal life. My cat can't decide if she wants to be in my lap, hanging around my neck, or rocking around on the floor. The folks living in China all wanted to make their emperor happy. If not happy, they sure didn't want to make him mad. This was a quick way to find out if there was an afterlife. Everything from minerals to plants was looked into for life prolonging qualities. As far as we know, since his body is hidden from sight, Emperor Qin died and was buried under that huge pyramid in Xi'an. As time marched on, people kept growing old and dying. Alchemists kept looking for ways to prolong life. Vlad III, Dracula, or Vlad the Impaler, due to his way of dealing with folks he didn't much like, was born in 1431 in Sighisoara, Transylvania, which is now in Romania. Vlad didn't attain immortality until Bram Stoker turned him into the main character in the book Dracula. If you saw the movie Coco, the spirits all want to be remembered so they could live on in the afterlife. Well, Dracula is very well remembered. In a way, you could say Vlad has attained immortality in that his name has lived for a long time. Vlad Dracula died 1476, north of the present day Bucharest. In the book, he was an immortal who stayed alive by drinking blood. The blood of humans and animals is a highly complex fluid which contains cells, various forms of nourishment for tissue, oxygen, antibodies, hormones, and other substances, which, when in balance, maintain health and well being. The Bible says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, for it is the life of all flesh, for the blood is life." The idea of prolonging life by using blood wasn't just some plot enhancer. People take verses in the Bible literally, and it does say life is in the blood. Alchemists investigated the use of blood for the elixir of life, but most wrote it was the wrong way to go. What they meant was blood didn't seem to prolong life, so the answer must have been something else. Well, that's what the scholars tell us they said anyway. Johann Conrad Dippel was an alchemist in Germany back in the late 1600s. He was born in a castle named Berg Frankenstein. I almost said Frankenstein. Some of y'all get that. It's Frankenstein. Anyway, Berg Frankenstein, or the Castle Frankenstein, in 1673. The name Frankenstein translates as stronghold of freedom in German. There were more than one castle using the name back then. It was one castle in a line of fortifications. It's Frankenstein, and it's Igor. Dippel dedicated most of his younger years to Marty Feldman, in case you didn't know. Get back to the story. Dippel dedicated most of his younger years to learning, since he was born to a rich family. He went to study theology and philosophy at the university in Gießen, somewhere in the late 1680s. By 1693, Dippel received his master's degree in theology. When he reached his 30s, he was devoting most of his time to alchemy, dabbling with dissecting animals to see what made them tick. Dippel went from being considered an up and coming theologian to a man who had lost his faith and turned to the dark arts. It's Igor and Frankenstein. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's from Young Frankenstein, the movie. Dippel turned animal parts into a solution he called Dippel's oil, which he claimed would cure any and all disease. He sold his product to anybody who believed him and had a little money. Stories began to circulate about his digging up dead people in the local cemetery and using them for his experiments. Dippel wanted to bring somebody back from the dead. Any of this sound familiar? If he could figure out how to reanimate a human corpse, he could figure out how to keep the spark of life going. The locals descended on the castle in typical Hammer film style with lit torches and pitchforks. A Dipple managed to escape out the back door as the locals were trying to get through the front door. Later, while trying to either bring somebody back to life or extend the life of someone, Dipple managed to blow up his workshop along with himself and his subject. Most of his equipment was destroyed. Keep in mind, there was no body to look at and say, well, looks like he screwed up. It just made folks sleep better at night thinking this madman was gone. The official story of Dipple says he died from poisoning in 1734. Now, who can we believe? Uh, just because a lot of people are saying it doesn't make it true. Those in charge of the world decide what we are all taught. So, did Dipple blow himself up? Did he die from poisoning? Or did something else happen to the man? Like, say, he kept on living? Uh, Keep in mind also that Zhu Yin, Lu Xiong, and Conrad Dipple were all trying to extend life and create immortality. Had they been successful, who might want to keep it a secret? If everybody was immortal, it would be awful crowded around here. A lot of folks wishing to attain immortality don't want to be just some member of the crowd. They want to be in charge of everything. Their philosophy is it is far better to rule in hell than to serve in heaven. I am willing to bet old Lucifer convinced them that that was a good idea. In 1730, life in Europe had taken on a bit of a change. The elites, the royals, were rapidly losing power. Peasants were now owning land, combined with a sudden increase in longevity. Instead of the average lifespan being about 40 years old, people were living up into their 60s. A Dipple's oil or just better nutrition? The Count Saint Germain was a European adventurer who achieved prominence in European high society in the mid 18th century due to his interest and achievements in science. My cat's running around, and I was waiting for her to dive into my chest or something. He had his interest uh, in science, alchemy, philosophy, and the arts. Saint Germain used a variety of names and titles, including the Marquis de Montferrat, Count Bellamar, Chevalier Schoning, Count Weldon, Count Schittkopf, Manuel Doria, Graf Zaragi, Prince Rogezai. His real name was never known, and his birth and background are obscure. Towards the end of his life, he claimed that he was the son of Prince Francis II Rochisi. It's spelled different from Rogozi, from Transylvania. During one of many dinner parties, the Count said he was 500 years old. His interests in alchemy had begun in the late 1600s and had continued on into the mid 1700s. This led Voltaire to dub him the Wonder Man, saying he is a man who does not die and who knows everything. Francis Marie Arrête de Voltaire was a French scientist, philosopher, and satirist who was born on November 21st, 1694. Not to be confused with Alessandro Giuseppe Antonio Anastasio Volta, who was an Italian physicist and chemist who was a pioneer of electricity and power, who is credited as the inventor of the electric battery and the discoverer of methane. The word volt comes from him, the Italian, not the Frenchman. Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel is recorded as having called Count Saint Germain one of the greatest philosophers who has ever lived. Count Saint Germain traveled about all of Europe and hung out with all of the elites of the time. Anyone wanting to hold a grand gathering of rich folks had to invite the Count to entice others to come, just as they could hang out with him and hear what he had to say. In the 18th century, it was good to be the king and have lots of money. While the poor folks were wondering just where were they going to get that cake they were supposed to eat, the rich were throwing huge parties, just like today. The Count was what was known as an A-lister. Some of these parties would go on all night, into the wee hours of the morning. Anyone who was very popular and what was known as a good looking guy was bound to draw attention to himself. Women would want to get closer to him, which would make men want to know who he really was and where he had come from. The Count had told so many people he came from so many different families, nobody really knew who he was. Was he from Spain or Germany or maybe France? Or could he have been Russian? If asked, he might tell a different story, even to the same group of people. Oh, and he also spoke many languages fluently. The Count was an accomplished musician. He dabbled in art. He knew many of the cities across Europe. Saint Germain was knowledgeable in science, understanding how electricity worked and which chemicals could be combined for certain outcomes. If you hang out with a small group of people, you can get away with making claims about science as long as nobody else in the group knows what you're talking about. Saint Germain ran in so many huge circles, he was constantly speaking about things in groups of folks who knew what he was saying and if it was correct or not. He impressed his audience with everything he said. He knew so much about so many things that people believed he had to be as old as he said he was. At gatherings back then, the subject of politics was always going to come up. In any big gathering, you're going to have people from both sides of the game. Like today, if you say you support one party, this makes you the enemy of the other group. Make enough enemies in the wrong places, and you're going to have to watch your back. The French had burned the Arcadian city in the Nova Scotia, even though the Arcadians were French. They'd said the wrong thing about the ruling people. Parliament passed Britain's Iron Act, designated to restrict the colonists from manufacturing goods by prohibiting additional ironworking businesses from producing fine goods. Sorry. If you didn't have iron hinges and shovels and tools, well, you were at a disadvantage. And they were trying to keep the colonists under their thumb. The French were pretending to be at peace with the British, while the Russians were pretending to be at peace with Japan. Spies were everywhere, since there were few restrictions on travel from one country to another. Many folks began to suspect that Count Germain was a spy, but they didn't know which country he was representing. Those who believed his story of being over 500 years old suspected he might be an alchemist who had achieved great knowledge. He knew way too much about way too many things to be just 20 or 30-year-old man. He had way too many talents. In the movie Groundhog's Day, Phil Connors learns how to play the piano, how to sculpt ice, how to speak French, all getting to a far advanced level only somebody with years of practice could achieve. Some say that the story is supposed to take place over 3,176 repeated Groundhog Days. Others say Phil Connors was stuck in the time loop for 12,395 days. The point I'm making is it takes a long time to get good at one or two things. It would take centuries to get good at everything. Count Saint Germain was said to be good at everything. Once again, he began stepping on toes. As more people were singing his praises, others wanted him gone, as in 6 feet under. Making enemies in high places is a bad idea. Getting into long, drawn out discussions on things like politics and the military might well get people to talking about things they just might want to keep to themselves. By saying something along the lines of, the French have a far superior navy because they're using a particular kind of a deck gun. Somebody might respond by telling all about the latest and greatest new British cannons being developed, which at that time were supposed to be kept secret. People just love to talk. Count Saint Germain was more than just an alchemical genius. He was an accomplished violinist. He was also adept at various other instruments, like the harpsichord. The character Lurch in the Addams Family, the series, not the movie, he was always playing the harpsichord. Saint Germain broke out his talents at various dinner parties and get togethers anytime he could. He was literally the life of the party. The Count contributed some of the songs to Le Inconstanza de Lusa, an opera performed at the Haymaker Theatre in London. He was an accomplished musician and he wrote music and songs to be performed in front of the elites of England. This was quite an accomplishment since most musicians spent years trying to come up with new numbers, while Saint Germain did it in his spare time. Writer and politician Horace Walpole wrote that the Count of Saint Germain was in London in 1743, where he was arrested on espionage charges but then quickly let go. According to A Dark Muse, A History of the Occult by Gary Latchman, this is the first confirmed mention of Saint Germain, who was kicked out of England after his release. Before that, his name would come up in conversations here and there, but never was he actually mentioned as being in a particular location. Saint Germain appeared in the French court around 1743, and by 1749 he was employed by Louis XV for diplomatic missions. A mime and English comedian known as Milord Gower impersonated Saint Germain in Paris salons. His stories were wilder than the real Count, going as far as to say that he had advised Jesus at one time. Saint Germain was the Chuck Norris of the 1700s, without all the fighting. You know, Chuck Norris drove his mom home from the hospital the day after he was born. Giacomo Casanova described Saint Germain in his memoirs after having several meetings with this unknown man. Yes, this is the same Casanova you're probably thinking of. His first encounter was 1757 at a dinner party. Most of these lavish parties went on all night and involved a lot of what passed for polite society rituals. You had to behave in a particular way, and this would show whether you were high society or just some upstart. You actually went to schools to learn how to attend a party correctly. Casanova said during a dinner party, instead of eating, Saint Germain told about his many adventures. Most folks would eat while listening, but Casanova did his best to mimic the speaker by not eating, only listening. During the party, Saint Germain did the ladies' makeup. He had brought a special cream that he said would not make them younger, but it would make them look younger. Have you ever looked at how the folks in Paris did their makeup back then? It was all the rage to have very white skin, as in like a corpse. Seeing as lead was a major ingredient in makeup, The look could soon become permanent. Then the cheeks were highlighted with red to make them look like the guy in the movie Saw. Bathing was not a thing back then. Perfume was applied heavily to mask the funk. Those great big dresses were worn for days without ever being cleaned or changed sometimes. If the need came up to go visit the office, there was no toilet paper. You used whatever was at hand, or you just used your hand. Ugh, aren't you glad we live in today's world? We have toilet paper and air conditioning and coffee. I'll bet by the end of the night there was a haze hanging over the ballrooms that would require a case of Lysol to evacuate. King Louis XV had a wife, and he had several mistresses. The most famous of them was Madame de Pompadour, who was the chief mistress. I didn't know there was a rank given to women of negotiable affections. Saint Germain got on her good side, and King Louis XV hired him as a court adviser. A lab was put in at the count's disposal so he could work on his latest creations. Most had to do with keeping the ladies looking young and acceptable, but there were a lot of things going on that nobody understood. To stay on the good side of the king, Saint Germain taught the king some chemistry, and this got the king into alchemy as well. During these lab experiments, Saint Germain said he was able to melt diamonds. He would get a handful of small stones and set them together. He did all the things people do while performing chemistry or magic, and soon he would have one huge diamond. Now, one diamond is worth a heck of a lot more than a handful of small ones. Casanova began saying that Saint Germain was an impostor. At the same time, he began telling people, Casanova that is, was actually 300 years old and he had traveled the world learning everything there was to know. It looks as if Casanova was trying to become Saint Germain. Rumor has it Saint Germain was involved in the overthrow of Tsar Peter III and replacing him with Catherine the Great. For a total stranger to show up and help lay plans to overthrow a sitting monarch would be near impossible unless he were connected to some powerful locals who belonged to secret societies. There were things people were not allowed to know or even think about before the Renaissance. Even as people were pulling their heads out of the ground and beginning to think, there were subjects considered too dangerous for common men to contemplate. Things like, why is the king allowed to run things? Or, who says common folk can't own land or switch jobs if they wish? This led to the creation of secret societies where people got together and thought about, oh, say, how do we overthrow the King of England and create our own country? Things like that. You had to have a group of like minded people you could trust to the ends of the earth, or face getting either your neck stretched or your head chopped off. The odds of Saint Germain belonging to some secret organization, or maybe several, are highly likely. March 1760, at the height of the Seven-Year War, Saint Germain traveled to The Hague. The Seven-Year War was something that took place between 1756 and 1763. It was a global conflict that spanned 5 continents, though it was known in America as the French and Indian War. After years of small battles between England, Spain, and France being fought in North America, England officially declared war on France in 1756. This is why years later the French sided on the colonists during the war. the Revolution. Why this was never called World War is anybody's guess. It could have been World War One, but nobody ever called it that. Even Churchill asked why it wasn't named that. The French, British, and Spanish battles over their colonies in the New World, Frederick the Great of Prussia in Europe faced off against troops from Austria, France, Russia, and Sweden. Everybody was fighting everybody else. The Seven-Year War ended with two treaties. The treaties of Herbertsburg greatly enhanced Prussia's power on the European continent. The Treaty of Paris between France, Spain, and Great Britain drew colony lines that largely favored the British. This lopsided treaty would later influence the French to intervene on the side of the colonists. I have to ask, why is it that people are more relatable to the British and not to the French? People travel to England all the time. People from England come to the United States. It's almost like we're brothers or cousins or something. Whereas France is looked on as being almost a third world country by some folks here on my side of the pond. Why do folks in the U.S. feel closer affinity to Britain and not to France? After all, it was the British that we were fighting, and it was the French who came to help us. Without the help of France, the United States would still just be a colony of England. Well, it's one of those mysteries in life. In Amsterdam, Saint Germain stayed with the bankers, Adrian and Thomas Hope, and pretended that he had come to borrow money for Louis XV using diamonds as collateral. While he was there, he assisted Bertrand Philipp, a Count of Gronsveld, to start a porcelain factory in Weeps. The Count acted as the furnace and the color specialist. Uh, just one more thing that he was an expert at, that nobody could understand how he got to be an expert at so many things. Saint Germain tried to open peace negotiations between Britain and France with the help of Duke Louis Ernest of Brunswick Lunenburg. British diplomats concluded that Saint Germain had the backing of Duke de Belle Isle and possibly of Madame Pompadour, the lady of negotiable affections, who were trying to outmaneuver the French foreign minister, the pro-Austrian Duc de Choiseul. Too many French names that I can't pronounce, which is weird, seeing as my grandfather on my mother's side was French. Britain refused to negotiate with Saint Germain unless his credentials come directly from the French king. The Duc de Choiseul convinced Louis XV to disavow Saint Germain and demand that he be arrested. Count Bentnik de Roon, a Dutch diplomat, regarded the arrest warrant as internal French politicking in which Holland should not involve itself. I tried hooking my cough button back up, but it will not communicate with the computer either. Must be something inside the computer. A direct refusal to extradite Saint Germain was also considered impolite. De Roon facilitated the departure of Saint Germain to England with a passport issued by the British Ambassador General, Joseph Yorke. The passport was blank when he got it, and Saint Germain simply filled in any details, such as his name and place of birth and things. Keep in mind, things were a lot different back then. You could call yourself just about anything as long as you didn't run into somebody who either knew you or the person you claimed to be. A lot of travel documents were handwritten by scribes, so the handwriting could easily be forged. Plus, the law was different for ladies and gentlemen than for everyone else. The police department wasn't going to be created until 1829 in London, so the folks in charge of enforcing the laws were the soldiers, who were mostly overworked, uneducated, and underpaid. You walk up to a bunch of soldiers on the dock and you tell them that you're the Emperor of the North Pole, show them a piece of paper with your name and North Pole written on it, and they would have to believe you because they wouldn't know any better. In 1774, the Count returned to France when Louis the 16th and Marie Antoinette were occupying the throne. He warned them that a revolution was going to come in about 15 years. This would make the Count a seer as well as a immortal. In 1779, Saint Germain left Great Britain once more, and arrived in Altona in Schleswig, Germany, where he made an acquaintance with Prince Charles of Hesse-Kassel, who also had an interest in mysticism. The prince was a member of several secret societies, and he probably either initiated Saint Germain into one, if not several. That is, if Saint Germain weren't already a member. You know, the old secret handshake and all. The count showed the prince several of his gems and convinced him that he had invented a new method of dyeing cloth. Dyeing cloth was a huge industry at the time, and a lot of money could be made by using new techniques. The prince was impressed, and he installed the count in an abandoned factory at Eichenford, which the prince bought especially for the count. At one time in Europe, a prince and a count were pretty much the same thing. It depended on which part of the world you'd come from. After a few years, the title prince was inherited and count was more appointed. The count and the prince worked together a lot and soon put in alchemy supplies and equipment along with the textiles. The two men worked on making gemstones and other pursuits. At some point in time after meeting the prince, around 1778 to as far as 1784, the count is supposed to have gotten sick, been confined to his bed, and eventually he died. Just as there are no records of when and where the count was born, his death was a bit of a mystery as well. Word spread that Count Saint Germain was dead, but then he would pop up in some location, being recognized by folks who had not only met him, but that knew him fairly well. Saint Germain was a member of the Illuminati, the Masons, and maybe a Knights Templar. The Templars were done away with in 1312, but if Germain was 500 years old, well, he could have been a member of them as well. The Templars in Germany were not rounded up like they were in France. Countess von Georgi claimed that she had known Count Saint Germain many years in the past. She had met the man in 1710, and 50 years later the Count looked hardly different at all. He admitted to having met with her decades ago, and he simply said that yes, he was very old. The Count Saint Germain was seen years after his reported death. He was spotted hanging out with hypnotist Anton Mesmer in Germany, and in late 1780 or early 1790s, the Count was chosen as a Freemason representative for a convention. They didn't send lower members to these get togethers. This was reserved for the higher ups, the guys who had been members for years. He also popped up in the aftermath of the fall of the Bastille in 1789. He had a conversation with a group of French nobles, as well as the Countess Adheimer, where he talked about France's future after the incredible upheaval of the Revolution. The Countess said she had seen him on a few more occasions up until 1820, writing that each time she met with Saint Germain, he had never aged a day. Count Saint Germain was seen in 1743 looking as if he was about 25 to 30-year-old man. He was seen in 1789 looking about the same age. Once more in 1820. Now, by this time, he should have been 90 years old, yet everybody who encountered him said the Count had not changed a bit. How could anybody outlive those around them without drawing attention to themselves? The easiest way would be to fake your own death or simply disappear. The Count was a celebrity who basked in the limelight. It sounds as if he thrived on the attention of those around him. This would make disappearing very hard. In 1821, the Count changed his name, moved to a new location, and then continued with his usual activities. This led to him running into people who said they knew him, now going by the name of Major Fraser. Albert Van Dam wrote of meeting a man who bore a striking resemblance to Count Saint Germain. He called himself Major Fraser, living alone and never alluded to his family. Moreover, he was lavish with money, though the source of his fortune remained a mystery to everyone. He possessed a marvelous knowledge of all the countries in Europe at all periods. His memory was absolutely incredible, and curiously enough, he often gave his hearers to understand that he had acquired his learning elsewhere than from books. Many in the time he has told me, with a strange smile, that he was certain he had known Nero and had spoken with Dante, and so on. Between 1880 and 1900, Saint Germain's name once again became prominent when members of the Theosophical Society, including famed mystic Helen Blavatsky, claimed that he was still alive and working towards the spiritual development of the West. The Theosophical Society is an organizational body of the Theosophy, an esoteric religious movement. It was founded in New York City in 1875. Among its founders were Helen Blavatsky, a Russian mystic, and the principal thinker of the Theosophical movement, and Henry Steele Olcott, its first president. It draws upon a wide array of influences, among them older European philosophies and movements such as Neoplatonism and occultism, as well as parts of Asian religious traditions such as Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam. There is a photograph going on around the internet that is supposed to be of Blavatsky and Saint Germain together. I tried to find it, but there are so many bad photoshopped images to sort through, I finally gave up. In 1897, the famous French singer Emma Calvé dedicated an autographed portrait of herself to Saint Germain. The best way to keep unwanted attention without becoming a recluse would be to travel to the New World. With thousands of others all sailing across the Atlantic to seek a new life, he might eventually run into somebody that he had met before. He could have simply said, "You must be mistaken. I'm not who you think you are." Or he could say, "Yes, I am the Count." And then anyone who this witness talked to, people just wouldn't believe them. Germain moved into New Orleans mansion in 1902. He was now going by the name Jacques Saint Germain, saying that he was a descendant of Count Saint Germain. Why Saint Germain traveled to New Orleans is anybody's guess. But when he arrived with a bang. Everybody in town knew he was there. Upon moving into the home at Ursulinus and Royal Street, he threw a lavish party to announce his arrival. Jockeys had a mysterious past, but it didn't matter to the local elites since he was one of the wealthiest and highly cultured people in the city. He was charismatic, spoke numerous languages, and told engrossing tall tales of adventure. These parties became a regular occurrence for the new luminary. Despite never eating any of the food provided and only drinking what appeared to be red wine, the public took to the charismatic new character of the French Quarter. During one of his extravagant parties, a young woman, shall we say another lady of negotiable affections, was either led to or invited into a secluded area of the mansion. Saint Germain, now alone and maybe hungry, attacked her. He is supposed to have grabbed the woman, held her head back, and tried to suck blood from her neck. The Count is now a vampire? This would explain his long life and vast knowledge as well as his immense wealth. His ability to turn small diamonds into huge ones would have made him very rich. Vampires don't suck blood from their victims. They rip the throat open and lap the blood up as it runs from the wound. Maybe this is what he was trying to do, only his prey had other ideas, like living and not being somebody's dinner. Believe it or not, people who grew up in the Americas were a bit bigger and a bit stronger than their counterparts in Europe. This was because of the abundance of food and clean water. Not giants or anything like that, just a little bit bigger and a little bit stronger, to a point a European man might not be able to overpower a young female as easily as he thought. Perhaps she was just a bit stronger than he thought she should be. Party-goers looking to find their host ventured to the room and began pounding on the door, trying to coax Jacques to come out and join the rest of the party. After all, he is always the life of the party. This startled the man, and he allowed the woman to get away. Not seeing any other means of escaping her attacker, she ran to the window and dove through them. The balcony was narrow, and she went over the railing, landing in the street below. She survived with a broken leg, a lot of lacerations, and a bunch of bruises. When the police arrived, Saint Germain told them that that woman was obviously drunk, a teller of tales. The woman was taken to the hospital, where she continued to say that Jacques had tried to rip her throat out with his teeth. The Count was rich, and he had influential friends. The police wanted to get a statement from him, but said it would be fine for him to present himself at the police station in the morning. Even today, those with money live under a different set of rules than the rest of us peasants. Morning came, and Saint Germain was not at the station. The police went to his home, only to find not only was Jacques Saint Germain no longer in residence, neither were any of his belongings. Rich folks had servants, people to do all the things like cooking and cleaning and taking out the garbage. During all of these fancy parties, Jacques had hired local waiters and waitresses, along with caterers, to fill the bellies of his visitors. Everything needed to throw a party was brought in, used, and then taken away. Jacques' kitchen was bare. There was nothing to make food with, and there was no food in the house. No personal possessions could be found except a few wine bottles that were found in some of the lower cabinets. Being a good law enforcement types, somebody uncorked a bottle and took a swig. There was something wrong with the wine. It had something added that did not come from a grape. Mixed in with the wine was blood, human blood. The police searched the entire house, and they found something they were not expecting. Some of the rooms on the second floor were devoid of any furniture, but they were covered in blood stains on the floors and on the walls. Each seemingly have occurred at a different point in time. They found a few more wine bottles, also containing that special blend. An arrest warrant was issued, but Jacques Saint Germain was long gone. The most recent appearance of a man claiming to be Saint Germain was 1972 in Paris, when a man named Richard Chainfree announced that he was the legendary Count. He appeared on French television, and to prove his claim, he turned lead into gold while using a camp stove. Chanfrey later committed suicide in 1983, or at least that's what they tell us. It could have been Chanfrey was just some guy looking for attention, and this was his way of getting it. Or maybe he had been encouraged to tell folks he was Saint Germain, since he looks a lot like the Count. The Count might have been watching from some far off resort as the man that was to play him performed for those who wanted the Count dead, and Chanfrey was used to get the heat off. We can't trust the folks responsible for telling us the truth. They seem to be repelled by the truth. Maybe this is all just wishful thinking. Nobody can live forever, or at least hundreds of years. And I gotta say it, nobody expects the Spanish Inquisition. Oops. Yes, I'm having one of those days. Nobody can live forever or at least hundreds of years. If there were people out there with immense wealth and longevity, they would also have the means of keeping their existence secret. You've heard the stories of how certain celebrities are drinking the blood of children to stay young. Well, there's a new thing going around that might just startle you. Over 100 people have participated in clinical trials at San Francisco startup offering blood transfusions for older patients. Each procedure costs $8,000 and sees the patient injected with 2.5 liters of plasma, the liquid element of blood that remains after other cells have been removed, taken from young people. The procedure is being offered as an experimental attempt at rejuvenating the elderly. The median age of their patients is 60 years. All along our southern border, you'll find companies that buy blood. They advertise in Mexico. They only want young, healthy donors. The average pay is $20 to $50 per bag, which is then sold for $8,000. Somebody is making a killing here. Why drink blood and run the risk of getting some nasty disease when you can buy it from a company that screens the donors, processes the red stuff, and then pumps it into you? You also avoid all that negative press for kidnapping kids. Over the centuries, people have used everything from mercury to gunpowder to try living longer. Many of these elixirs led to a much shorter life than was expected. After all, mercury is poisonous. The alchemists said that blood was the wrong direction to take. Was this a fact, or did they want to keep the secret to themselves? What good is it to live forever if you're crowded into a small corner by everybody else who's living forever? Well, we may never know. But then again, things keep coming up all the time. Somebody pops up in the news and says they know the secrets, and then they commit suicide. Hope you enjoyed tonight's show. If you did, tell others they should be listening to the show. If you'd like to buy a t shirt, you can find my stuff at tpublic.com. Simply look for Strange Things with Chris James. If you'd like to buy one of my books, you can find those at Amazon.com. Or if you are in Laredo, go by the Organic Man Coffee Trike. You can find them there as well. and pick up a bag or two or three of the best coffee on the planet. Till next time, this is Chris James for Strange Things. Remember, baby fly, hope you enjoyed the show. Wrong button.